Nanci Trivellato, and today I have the great pleasure to be here with Dr. Peter Fenwick. Dr. Fenwick, he is a neuropsychiatrist and a neurophysiologist, a pioneer and a leading authority in near-death experience, as many of you might well know, but he's also an international expert on sleep and epilepsy and the phenomena around death. He is also the president of the Scientific and Medical Network and the president of the British branch of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. So, without further ado, thank you very much, Dr. Fenwick, for receiving me, for being here, for taking the time. I know you are a very busy person, so I would like to start by asking you from the origins, from the beginning. What made you interested in studying near-death experience? Because, of course, you were a medical doctor, working in your profession as most of the medical doctors are, and you started something that I think was very remarkable and made a big impact, at least in my point of view, in science in general, especially to study consciousness. So how does your interest came to be, or was it a personal thing or professional?
No, there were two major stimuli.
Mm-hmm.
The first one was I was interested in meditation, and that was the time that in science you couldn't talk about meditation. It was forbidden. And then the Maharishi came, and the Beatles started to learn it, and we had the pleasure of recording the EEG of George Harrison when he was meditating. So I had that record in the lab for a long time. Thought it might make a nice pension selling sheets of George Harrison's EEG, but somebody else got there first, and so it got lost. But that was an enormously important stimulus, and it started my research career into altered states of consciousness, and I became interested in what happens in meditation, learned about the phenomenology of wider states of consciousness and transcendence. And so with that as a background, it was no surprise that I should go one step further. But this was about, I think probably when I was about 30, I didn't believe one word about near-death experiences. They were rubbish. They happened in California. It certainly would never happen in England. They couldn't possibly cross the Atlantic. And then this guy turned up in my consulting room. He got an acute anxiety state. He'd just come out of hospital. And he told me that he was having a cardiac catheter and his heart stopped. He told me that he left his body and watched the resuscitation process. And that apparently this was a very unusual happening to them because they hadn't got the oxygen ready or anything like that and couldn't ventilate him. And so he watched this chaos from what he said was the corner of the room. And then he went down the tunnel, met a being of light, met dead relatives, into, in his case, an English country garden. Then there was a decision as to whether he was to come back or not, and he decided he would, so he came back. And there was no return journey, he just was back in his body again after they had resuscitated him. So I couldn't any longer pretend that these were things which couldn't be studied and which weren't, certainly for the people who had them, enormously real, but much more important is they could possibly tell us something about the nature and structure of consciousness. So that was my learning experience, and that meant that they were probably occurring in the hospital as I was in at that time. And so I went to see the person in intensive care and said, I'd very much like to ask people questions, just that, ask them questions after they came out of intensive care, because they may have experiences when they're unconscious. And he said, absolutely no, you can't do that. You might upset them. Isn't it interesting how far we've moved since then? And so it was about another 4 or 5 years before I got permission to do some of my first studies into near-death experience.
I think you were very brave to pursue that, because I can imagine the amount of prejudice. Because I think still nowadays we have a little prejudice because many people still think that may have other explanations in spite of classical examples like you just described. I think you described it a very classical case. Would you put it this way? Someone seeing their own body and seeing something and meeting relative ones and experiencing the tunnel. Would you put that as a classical near-death experience?
Yes, but we have to be very careful. First of all, when you approach near-death experiences, you want to be absolutely clear where you stand. If you stand on a reductionist explanation, then there are a whole set of phenomena, and you are compelled by your theory to put them in the brain. And since I wanted to know what was happening in the brain with these experiences, it was very important. So if you choose that as your ground on which you stand, then that has to be your answer. If, on the other hand, you want a transmission theory, in other words, consciousness is wider than the brain, then you get a whole different set of answers. Now, the problem is really for the person who is looking at near-death experiences. Both views give you a different set of answers. Both views are equally constructive in our understanding of consciousness, but there is no need to detract the other person's point of view because he's not standing on the same ground as you. And a lot of the discussion is just about the different views you get from where you stand. So that's enormously important.
Definitely. How far do you think we have come so far in terms of accepting these different perspectives for scientific research?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. It's interesting because you're going to set up your research according to your view of what the near-death experience might be, and also, of course, the limitations that science puts on you in how you're going to do it. Now, I wanted to know the answer to the question, is this totally brain-based or not? So if you look at the phenomenology of it, you find it's very wide. Again, I was very lucky because in 1987, I did the first British broadcast on near-death experiences. And this resulted in over 2,000 letters. Do you remember letters? Not like email.
Wow. Yes, letters, the ones that we receive with the regular post.
That's right. We got 2,000 of those.
Yes, wow.
And so that produced a huge database. And so I catalogued the letters and looked at what people were saying. And the argument always was, but you don't have standardized data. So what I did is I took 500 experiences, which is already a frame on it, you see, starting to restrict the data, and sent out questionnaires and got people to fill in. So we had a similar data set for 500 people. About 450 finally replied, so it reduced it a bit. And this told me one thing immediately, and that is that when you looked at causation, it would occur in many different situations, 10% in heart attacks, 2/3 didn't have drugs, that it occurred when you were very frightened, but there was no change in cerebral functioning, in other words, just fright.
I see. That prompts it.
Yes. And it would happen quite spontaneously when you're sitting in front of the fire at home. Now, if you are really a neuropsychiatrist and you're interested in brain function, then you have to choose the ones where you can understand the brain state. I mean, I have no idea what your state is at home when you get one of these things. Have you been drinking, been taking drugs, etc. Or during childbirth. Is it because you've got low blood pressure? What is it? You see, you can't tell. But the one thing you can tell is cardiac arrest.
Mm-hmm.
So in cardiac arrest, the brain goes through a very stereotyped series of steps and changes as its function decays and finally stops. So you know exactly where you are. And so that's why we chose cardiac arrest, because it was the obvious one where you could quantify brain state.
Yes. You had measures that you could compare and
Absolutely.
analyze them.
Yes. For example, when the heart stops, we know in 11 seconds the EEG, the electrical activity on the surface of the brain, dies away to zero. So that means that all those analysis circuits, those circuits which construct our world for us, aren't in fact functioning at that point. Then you know that even though you have the EEG not working on the surface, because animal experiments were done when they tied the animal's carotid arteries and stopped the brain flow, etc., we know that if it's not showing on the surface like that, then it's not in the depth either. So it means that they have relatively silent brains.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no way that a brain like that can construct consciousness. So it's a very, very good experiment to do, and so that's why we followed that through. And the question has always been timing. In other words, does the experience occur as you go down into unconsciousness? And my argument has always been it doesn't, because if you have a memory of that quality, you'll know that you're going down into unconsciousness. It's very quick, you see. You'll lose consciousness in 2 or 3 seconds usually, maybe a bit longer when the heart stops. But it's the physiology which then has to catch up.
Yes.
So it couldn't be when you go down, and it couldn't be when you recover, because all recovery from a prolonged period of heart stoppage is in fact confusional. And these experiences aren't confusional. So it can't be when you recover, it can't be when you go down. So when is it? Well, we suggested it was when you lost consciousness,
yes.
when your heart had stopped. Now that is extraordinarily interesting, very challenging to say that.
And probably bring very strong reactions, yes.
Very strong reactions. It's really wonderful, and it's usually from people who don't know the literature. Let's take a conference I was at recently, and I was describing one of the best near-death experiences with data surrounding it. And this is a person who was in the cardiac catheter lab, so he's being watched the whole time. And his heart stopped when they were putting the catheter in. And for some reason, which I don't know, they had an automatic defibrillator, and that gives instructions. So the person lost consciousness, was deeply unconscious. They shocked him, and the defibrillator said ventricular fibrillation suggests shock, so he was given one. And then you have to do something to the person if you're using this defibrillator, and that is to do a round of cardiac resuscitation by artificial ventilation and manipulating the chest, and that goes on for maybe a couple of minutes, something like that. And then the machine will tell you what to do, and in this case it said shock, and so he's given another shock and recovered. So we have a very, very good interval here. Now, the interesting thing is that when he lost consciousness, he said he went up into a corner of the room and watched the resuscitation process. He heard the instruction for the first shock. And when he was up there, he was joined by a woman who he knew to be an angel, he said. And he stayed there with her till the second shock, and then he came down. Now, in this conference, the person who I was with said, you know, he watched the whole process, said, this is ridiculous. If he was really out of his body, where are the ears that he has to hear with?
Oh.
Where are the eyes that he has to see with? They're all in the body.
Yeah.
So
see the perspective, yeah.
So he wouldn't get, if that's where it was, he wouldn't have an altered perspective, which he did have. But the person was saying, why should we believe this doctor next to me who says he thinks this is valid? Of course it's not, it's all made up. Do you see? So these are the sort of arguments that you get. And of course he's quite right in one way. If he thinks that you only get vision through the eyes, then of course it makes sense to him to say, but where are the eyes? But if he knew the literature on this, he would know there's such a thing as remote viewing, the CIA did during the war, and there's a lot of data on remote viewing where you can see things at a distance, it's known. So why is it then so remarkable that the guy was able to see it from on the roof? What I would have liked him to have done is to have known the literature and said, well, what is really interesting is quite clearly he wasn't using his physical eyes, he was using another method of perception, like you see in remote viewing. Then we could have had a really interesting discussion as to how that could be and so on. But as long as he stood on the physical ground, then what I was suggesting looked ridiculous on one hand, but from my point of view, because his brain wasn't working, his view looked ridiculous too. So there's bound to be a clash of some sort. And so you ask them, how can a brain that is not functioning work? And then they will become ridiculous. There are little parts of the brain which are still working. Well, that means he doesn't know his physiology. To construct consciousness, you need wide areas of the brain which are functioning appropriately. And so it becomes a non-conversation at that point. So there's no point in pursuing his arguments because it means usually he doesn't know the literature. I'm fortunate in that I do know the parapsychological literature because I've read it. And I do know the physical one, so I can see both sides. And then that leads me to think that in fact there is another mechanism of seeing at a distance than just with the eyes. When you don't, I mean, you're limited by the light.
Meaning there is some level of awareness independently of the body, and
it looks like it. I mean,
that would be a good explanation at least.
Yes, it will.
Right, because otherwise, how would one explain that? And I think that is what challenged people so much. Because I study out-of-body experience, I think it's harder to study out-of-body experience because you have more accounts, but then it's harder to make sure that the person is really understanding what an out-of-body experience is. And I think there are lots of reports that are not consistent to a real out-of-body experience, so it confuses. But when we get the number of cases like Robert Krukel, that he compiled so many cases and he did a great work, and I myself tried to devise some experiments, but because of this it's not so simple. But what I have been seeing, and I want your view on that, is that people, they can only accept, yes, you are alive here, the physical body, and you only perceive things with this body, and anything that is beyond, it's religious, it's God, some action of that, and there has nothing to do with the self. So I think that creates a barrier somehow, that people don't appreciate scientifically what means a real out-of-body experience or a near-death experience.
Yes, I think that's correct, but this in fact comes from the way that science evolved. So at the time of the Reformation, the Renaissance, then it was quite clear that some of the ideas relating to God, and also from some of the huge attacks on people that were made because of their belief structures at that time with the Inquisition and so on, had to be done away with. And so when science came along, the idea then that it was in fact only physical, and Descartes' point that it was all came through the pineal, and that's interesting too because that's changing, and that the soul in fact communicated through the pineal was perfect because nobody was going to put him in the Inquisition. Why should they? The soul belonged to God. He'd got a mechanism whereby it could come into the brain. Perfect. but it's something you couldn't study. So that's really the history of science.
Yes.
And when I was at school and at university, I was never taught the history of science. And so I was left with a very materialistic view of the world, which in fact didn't incorporate the reasons why it had come about. Because then once you understand that, then of course you can take it into account. And then with the advent of quantum mechanics, anyway, it all changed.
Yes. At that time, maybe this scientific basis or principles foundation was established. That was very positive because we kind of made a huge turn, and science has helping humankind so much. But these same foundations that were so important right now, maybe they are limiting us to some extent, right, Dr. Fenwick?
Yes, they just need to be extended. In other words, let's go back to the vision part again. Can you see without the physical eyes? That's a really interesting question. And if you insist that vision can only occur with physical eyes, then of course it becomes a nonsensical question. But in fact, if you look at the data, there are a lot of things that do need explaining in terms of visual perceptions of distance, which enhance our understanding of the range of conscious experiences. And one of the things about the near-death experience, when you look at it, the transcendent experiences are enormously enriching in what they show about what people can understand. Of course, there are many ways to get transcendent experiences. You can get them spontaneously in the near-death experience, you can get transcendent experience with drugs, etc. They're all slightly different and they all mean different things. But if we stick with the near-death experience, then the idea that they are just one stereotyped set of experiences is quite wrong, because they're not. Let's take the tunnel. In the data set we had, it became quite clear to me that the tunnel experience is usually a formulation of an experience that the person is having difficulty in categorizing. One of them said it was like the hose pipe which comes from a drying machine, you know, that root hose pipe. Well, that's okay, I mean, that's fine, that's what it seemed to them. Another one said, it must have been a tunnel because I saw reflections of the light on the wall. Do you see? So they're constructing a tunnel. Other people don't go anywhere near a tunnel experience. What they say is and these are the ones that go furthest. I was pure energy and floating in a black space, and then I was floating towards the light, and then the transcendent aspect of that experience goes on. So when you use words about these experiences, you're going to put it into something which is physical, because that's what you know, although the experience itself is often much wider than that.
Yes, definitely. Among all the hundreds of cases you studied, I know you studied, I think it was 300 cases, right? Am I correct with the numbers here? More than that, I suppose, right?
Yeah, about 400.
400 cases.
Yeah.
How many relatively, maybe you do not know exactly, but were children?
Our child set, we got about the same number of cases per decade, which is really interesting. So if you divide 400 by about 6 decades, then you can see how many cases there were in each decade.
And does that reveal anything different, Dr. Fenwick?
Children's experiences are quite different. First of all, they're very simple, because the child's classification system is simple. They don't have words for anything else. And they don't have, and their experience of experience, as it were, is limited too. So they can't go into explanations of wider states of consciousness. There's usually a person, often a shining figure, often people who come as angels and then interact with the child. And going to the ceiling is also something that they describe, but they're all very much simpler.
Yes, I imagine that for an adult, so hard to explain something that is not physical. Even physical things sometimes are hard to explain.
Yes.
Imagine for a kid. And so that is quite interesting. I am doing a study on kids, and I find the same thing. There are things that you want to find out, but you kind of have to read behind the words,
Yeah.
because they are not going to explain things in the same way that we would. Yeah?
Absolutely.
Very good. Dr. Fenwick, if you would suggest something for a future of consciousness science from now on, seeing all of these changes, witnessing so much of the maybe difficulty to put information ahead, even though it was a well-established, researched information, and also seeing the changes that have come. I think there are some fields that are helping with that. Near death, I think, is one of the fields that helped a lot. A little bit of the maybe quantum studies, at least create a little bit of opening to maybe argue that there could be something there we don't know. And maybe other studies that would be serious studies, like Dr. Jim Tucker, you're probably familiar with him, or past life recall on children. I think it's amazing studies that comes from Dr. Ian Stevenson. But considering all of this historical thing that we all know, and your experience, because you were at the very beginning of it, if you would suggest something for us who are working in that field now, what would you say from now on?
Okay, well, we've been talking about near-death experiences, so let's take these to the further reaches of near-death experiences. I'm interested in the change which occurs in people. There are a whole set of changes which are fairly stereotyping people get. We know that they're no longer afraid of death. We know that they are more spiritual, not religious, more spiritual. We know that they are more socially active, that they are more concerned about other people and so on. But there is another group, and I don't know how large it is yet, who become non-dual. And by non-duality, I'm talking about another state of consciousness which people go into. And non-duality, I think, is at the cutting edge of consciousness research. It's the state that we have to understand. Now, most of the teachers who are teaching are non-dual, of course, and most of the esoteric works, both traditional and modern, relate to non-dual states. So, what is a non-dual state? There are 4 questions. If I give a lecture on near-death experiences, I say that I want any of you who've had near-death experiences and have found that you've got a state change to ask yourself these questions. And the first one is, where do you live? Do you live absolutely fixed in the now? Or do you, like all of us, drift into the past or into the future? So are you absolutely fixed in the now? It's a very good question, because non-dual people are, we aren't. The next one I would ask is, tell me how you see people. Do you see people as just bodies, or do you see them as energy? And bodies, but mainly energy. And if you see them as mainly energy and bodies, then you're likely to be in a non-dual state. So what you've done is that you've expanded your range of perception in a very specific way. So you're seeing energy rather than just physical form. So that's the second question. The third question is, are you unbelievably happy? I mean, really deep down happy. So happy that when you scratch at the basis of yourself, you don't just come up with anxiety or I'm not good or anything like that. You're unbelievably happy. So that is the third one. And the fourth one relates much more to their views about the future, etc., which they don't have, because being locked in the present, you accept everything as it comes. In fact, you see the world as being created, arising, manifesting, and falling. You're not attached to this at all. This is your concept. There's no time in any sense, because each moment is separate from the next moment, and it's separate from the next moment because there isn't a future moment and there isn't a past moment, you see. So you've got a very different mental set there. And so that's the non-dual state. And most of the teachers you will find, in fact, are non-dual. Most of the confusion in the literature is because you're non-dual. For example, take the Bhagavad Gita and Arjuna saying it's quite okay to go to war and kill your relatives. Well, what does that mean? We would think that's a very harsh thing to say. But of course the war is the actions that you take in a specific set of circumstances in the moment. So you don't think those bastards of relatives of mine, I'm going to go and annihilate them. It's not like that. You're absolutely in the moment and you do what the moment says. It's simple as that. And it's a very different way of living. Now, I've only got 2 cases at the moment of people who have flipped into a non-dual state after the near-death experience. I think it's much more common. I just haven't been... there's no point in looking at past series because all people will say is that they're different in some way and they're not asked the 4 questions. But if you ask the 4 questions, you can get non-dual states very clearly. And if you become interested in non-duality, which I am, then you find it's all around you. For example, in one of the organizations I was with, one of the women there desperately wanted to awaken. Concept of awakening essentially is to go into a non-dual state, in fact. And she couldn't do it. And she remembers walking in a field and she came to the point, well, I'm never going to do this. I cannot go on in the dual state I'm in now because I really don't like it. And the only thing to do is suicide. She became extremely depressed. And when she recovered from that, she flipped. And so that's, I found a number of people have gone into non-dual states, have done it from acute sadness. Another woman, her brother died. She was absolutely distraught. Went to Italy. I don't know why Italy. She did. Spent 3 months there. And it was in the height of her sadness that she became non-dual. Then, of course, it doesn't mean anything your brother's dying because you're not in that level of consciousness. You're at a quite different level. Another person I met was an ordinary housekeeper, and she again did it through a period of sadness. And you remember Eckhart Tolle, if you read how he did it. He did it that way. It came to him that way. So it's quite a common way that this level of consciousness can occur spontaneously. Can you train it? Yes, of course you can. But to train it, you have to do a lot of self-cleaning. Because unless you can do self-cleaning, you will be always caught by your own hang-ups of various things. So if I was starting out on near-death research now, I would say, okay, I know what the phenomenology are because they're so widely described, but what I would do is I would actually look at those people who become non-dual and see what happens. One of the non-dual people occurred in Spain. I gave a lecture, and I found she very kindly came up after and said, yeah, I think you're talking about me, which I clearly had been. And she is running a teaching group, so that's what they start doing. They start teaching, in fact, that the world is not as you guys know it. It's actually very different and very much better in many ways. So I think I go into non-duality, but this actually brings me to the outer reaches of the near-death experience. In fact, the most profound near-death experiences, what are they like? Well, the leaving the body and going down the tunnel and seeing the being of light, they're pretty transcendental, but you can go further than that. And the English country garden, which we all stroll about in our near-death experiences, you can go much further than that, and you may never visit that type of experience. You may, one person I know, and this is, it's not a bad prototype, when his heart stopped, he went into a room where there were a whole lot of people who were faceless. Now, being faceless for me is interesting, because being a neuropsychiatrist, I immediately think, yes, the face area of the brain is short of blood. And that's why he can't construct faces. Yeah. But be that as it may, they were faceless, but they were all Zen monks. They all asked him questions. And the questions they asked were in fact transcendent questions about the nature of transcendence and the nature of reality at a very high level. And he found he could answer them, he knew what the answers were. And after the last question, the room and the people dissolved, and he was just an energy form. And the idea of transforming into pure energy is there right at the further reaches of the experience. And then what happens? Well, there is a period when you are pure energy without form, but widely consciousness. Consciousness at that level is enormously wide. You are universal in every way. As in fact, our near-death, our non-dual people, they also have a very wide feeling of consciousness. So they're part of the universe, not independent of it. And you generally, there's a movement, a drifting towards an expansion, towards, I mean, we're coming into areas of experience which you can't limit. Yes. Which you can't discuss and limit by our language. Mm-hmm. So they're very wide. And you go into fusing with the principal creative component of the universe. That's the sort of thing they say. And you can't tie them down for two reasons. One is they usually at this point are highly emotional. I mean, this is a fantastically wide state and you're very marked by it. And they in fact become very emotional. So if you're questioning somebody, if I was questioning you now and you broke down into tears, etc., as you were describing this, I would stop doing it, obviously, because I'm not going to push you through that sort of experience. So trying to get at the actual nature of these very wide experiences is difficult from that point of view. But they're also one thing, and that is that life never ends and never began, so you're never born and you never die. They're all very clear about that. And then that you are in fact part of the universal substance. You've never been created, or your consciousness has never been created. And so it's a really wide state, and everybody has it, but most of us, of course, have layers which have to be dissolved before you can experience that. And one of the ones who went furthest came back with gifts. And he's an interesting guy. He's an air traffic controller. And he's obviously a very competent guy, because he worked in the air traffic control in some of the major British airports, and was able to sort out a lot of difficulties, planes running with fog, planes running out of petrol and all that sort of thing. Well, it's kerosene now with jets. And he came back and his lifestyle changed. Now, I hadn't understood about the remarkable changes that occur. He started going on cruises and staying in the Ritz and doing things like that. It suddenly occurred to me that he'd got an income stream he'd never had before. Oh. So what was it? And he asked me to go and dine with him, my wife and I, to go and dine with him at the Ritz, which we did. And so I said, have you got any tips for me? Any tips for the stock exchange? And he looked at me and he knew exactly what I was saying immediately. And this is just what he had been doing, because he'd become very intuitive. He knew what was going to happen. He said, yes, buy BT shares.
Yes.
And I said, okay, thanks very much. And then we went on with our discussions. And when I left, I looked at BT and they were right down. I'd never buy shares, they were going to buy BT. So I just parked the information instead of acting on it. And what happened? Of course, in 3 months, they were way up.
Oh.
Yeah, and he had foreseen that, and that's another cruise for him. So it's interesting, you get different sorts of gifts from these experiences. But his was very deep and very profound.
That shows how little we actually know about our potential.
Oh, that's absolutely true.
And so, in maybe the little we know in science today, which is a lot, right?
Yeah.
And knowledge grows exponentially every day. But with that little, that now we know is little, imagine all of this that is out there that is related to maybe consciousness, self, mind, whatever people want to call it, and we don't know. I'm going to ask you something that certainly you're going to feel like, I don't have a proper, complete, objective answer to that, but I would love to hear your opinion. What do you think limits the most people to achieving that level of non-duality or sensing themselves as something beyond only the physical body?
I think that's becoming much clearer, much clearer. It goes back to some of the work by Jim Tucker and Stevenson, the idea that in fact there is a recurrence of your conscious essence in some way, and that it's marked by the form that you take in the next life. Now, it's very controversial, the evidence isn't good, but it's going to be along those sort of lines. And it would seem that when you come into this world, you have specific tasks, and the tasks are mainly in clearing the way that you are, and that all of us, if we really look at ourselves, will see that we are limited by psychological issues of various types. And the other interesting thing about psychological issues of various types is they lead to repetitive behavior. The person who chooses a wife, the relationship breaks down, he becomes abusive, changes his wife and finds another wife who would never provoke this in him. They stay together for a bit, he becomes abusive, rejects his own wife. I mean, it's on repeat the whole time. The person who is in his company and can't cope with it, he goes up the ladder and gets to a point where he's promoted beyond his efficiency. And so he will then change company, same thing will happen. So it's repeat. So in order to understand why you're always on repeat like this, you have to in fact see what are the psychological processes which cause them. Most of them in fact tend to be parental. I mean, when you're very young, an aggressive father will obviously lead to you modelling yourself, particularly if you're a girl, on your father, but the boys in fact will take that as a model as well. So the things like this, that you have to see that this is not your essence, this is something which is coating you, if you like. And I think that the ability to experience wider states is part of the clearing process until you get yourself refined to a point where non-duality will come. And then of course you have to refine yourself further and further, because there are layers and layers and layers of non-duality. And there's some very good books. Merrill Wolff is a nice American author that talks about this, and he talks about once you are non-dual, you're like a 1,000-watt lamp compared to the 25-watt lamp of your ordinary consciousness. And he gives another nice picture about the archetypes surrounding the world as a black, detailed, restrictive cover, and only occasionally do people put their heads through it and see what is beyond it, and those are people who are going non-dual. You get feelings for this in near-death experience. Ibn Alexander is a very good one, where he goes down into all the entanglements. That Merrill Wolf would be doubtless arguing is in fact part of the world archetype when he comes out. So I think that what holds us back really is our own psychology, and it's the clearing of that. And now we come to an interesting point, and this is technology, how you get cleared. Well, there are a lot of technologies around which come from the main religious traditions, Buddhist, Zen, Tibetan, Christian. They all have their own technologies for clearing. And when you can do the clearing work, then you will, in fact, are more likely to enter a non-dual state and progress further.
That's very interesting. So, with all of these different factors, you would say the early ages of life play a big role there in restricting people from seeing all of these. Can I put this in this way from what you explained, Dr. Fenwick?
It's an interesting, very interesting point, that, because does it mean that we have to improve our child rearing to make the burden that each of us carries much less? And I suppose the answer to that is yes.
Yes, I think that is always a good thing, right? Yes. Now, I think all of this topic kind of challenge a lot, because when it tells us we don't die and we can be reborn, that defies the very essence of what lots of people believe in. That is what religion has been telling us for so long. Science now has so big role in society, but the truth is, almost everyone, they still hold to themselves some sort of religious knowledge or principle. They would say, I keep both. I'm very scientific, but I also believe in something. And what we are saying is, what if instead of believing in something that is beyond this world, or some sort of stronger energies, or being in a better place after death, what if instead of only believing, we could actually show its truth? I think that challenges a lot. Dr. Fenwick, if I may ask you, if you would be able to change one thing in all of this career you had, or if you would wish one thing would have been different, and this one thing doesn't have to be one thing, it can be an event, a period, or anything, what would it be, if you care to share with us?
Yes.
If you don't mind.
No, I don't mind at all, because I'm one of the lucky ones, had a really nice life. I was brought up in Kenya, so I had a very free childhood, which was great. I wouldn't change anything, because I've come to the point where I see every experience that I've had as part of a learning process, in fact. If I'm prepared to learn from it. Sometimes you get a big push and you learn a lot. Sometimes there are little pushes and you ignore them.
Yes.
But essentially it seems to be part of a learning process. And so if I go back and say I would like that changed and so on, then it means I have actually failed to understand what the process is. Yeah. Because I've still got a large ego then that is wishing to change it. It's not to do that.
Wishing to control it, right?
Yeah,
control
absolutely.
things, yes.
Absolutely. No, just be in the moment and act from there.
Mm-hmm. And have you ever had any personal experience, if you don't mind telling us, otherwise we don't keep here, but Would you ever have any personal experience that you would call transcendental or something like that?
Everybody has transcendent experiences. One of the things that I'm interested in at the moment is light. And it's just beginning now to surface in the scientific literature. There are 1 or 2 studies of light that people experience on retreats. And I think it's probably quite difficult now for you to go on a retreat and not have a wide transcendent experience of some sort. If you don't, then you're not making full use of the retreat. So transcendent experiences are not something to be sought after because you've already put a limitation around it. I like Metropolitan Antony's story. I don't know if you know it. It's a wonderful one. He was in Russia. I don't know how old he was, 7 or 8 or something like that. And he came from a poor family. And he used to have to walk to school. And his feet were extremely cold. He didn't have proper shoes and the proper clothes. And there was this wonderful bakery on the way. So out of the door came warmth and heat and light and the most delicious smells. And he would stand there breathing in this wonderful aroma, and then it was time to get on to school, so he would then leave and walk away from the bakery. And he realized that the smells and the delicious foods and everything were not for him. His path was quite different from that. And that to carry them with him in that sense of claiming them only made him profoundly unhappy. So he realized that, yeah, enjoy them when you buy at the bakery door, leave them there, and don't take them with you. And I think he tells that story with regards to transcendence, and I think it's absolutely right. So the experiences are just experiences for you, but for goodness sake, don't hold them and keep them. Every time I tell you about the wonderful things that have happened to me, all I'm doing is just limiting myself further.
Yes, so it depends a lot on how we can merge, enter the experience and learn from it. Right?
Absolutely.
It's a lot about attitude. I think it's a lot inside of us.
That's correct.
That has been wonderful. Is there anything else you would like to tell us or share that I have not asked, Dr. Fenwick?
Yes, we haven't talked about death, and I think we need to talk about death. You can see that I should be extremely interested in death because it's a process which I'm going to go through in the not too distant future. I studied it, and I studied it because I read a book about deathbed coincidences. Somebody was dying and somebody else saw them, and I thought that's interesting. Who's in the different state of consciousness, the person who's dying or the person who sees the apparition? And so I thought I would look into it. And when this is in 2000, when I looked at the scientific literature on deathbed phenomena, it was practically zero. You could have been a world expert by reading 2 papers. I mean, that's all there was there.
Yes, what a difference,
I was very lucky in getting a grant from the BL Foundation to do this, and so I looked at hospices in this country and in Rotterdam. You always research where you have mates, in fact. I had mates in Holland, mates in England. And I said to the committee, listen, what I'd like to do is to ask dying people about what their experiences are as they die. And the committee said, absolutely not. We think this would be very disturbing for the dying people. And but what you can do is a carer study. Ask the carer what they experience in the dying. So I ran with that and did it, and it was a wonderful thing to have done because I found immediately that the medical profession is in fact, their view of death and dying is very different from that of the nurses. the hospice workers, because the hospice workers see and are in contact with the dying, whereas in fact the doctors tend not to be. So that was the first point. So if you want to know what goes on when people die, ask the nurses, don't ask the doctors.
Yes.
So let's for the moment just rule out things like pain and so on, because this can all be controlled by drugs now. And I just want to talk about the actual phenomenology of dying. There's no doubt that if you're conscious, then in the last fortnight usually, or 3 weeks before you die, you will see dead relatives. They will come into the room, they will sit on the bed, they will talk to you. Sometimes they're friends. I've got very, very bad news if you have cats and so on who you love very dearly. Very occasionally are they seen, but not often.
Relatives.
Yeah, the relatives come.
They are there.
They will tell you when they're going to come back and pick you up, so you can negotiate with them. I don't want you to come back this Friday because my son is coming from Australia, so I'd like to do a little bit longer. So that you can organise. And then some people have lucidity, terminal lucidity, what the Victorians called lightening up before death, when people can have been unconscious in a coma, and their consciousness will return for a very short period of time. It's relatively normal. Even in profound Alzheimer's, they will come out of consciousness, recognise
a relative or someone who is present there?
Yeah, who they've never met, who they've never recognised.
For the past many years,
Yeah, so science really needs to get a handle on this, because it's amazing. All these memories are there. Also there are some interesting accounts of people who've been mute all their lives or deaf all their lives who hear and speak in this phase. It needs much more scientific analysis. And then you die. We'll talk about the death process in a moment because there's more data on this. But what we found was that a number of people have deathbed coincidences and they're driven by the person who's dying. We've got very good evidence, and we looked at 45 deathbed coincidences, and they showed that they occur within a few minutes of death, and certainly within half an hour of death. And in it, the person goes to somebody, and the form that takes depends on the level of consciousness of the person they're appearing to. If they're awake, then it's a very strong feeling that this person is in distress and needs help, or they give you a message which is, don't worry, I'm okay. But that was relatively rare in our series. If the person's asleep, it's a narrative dream, and the narrative dreams are very clear. The person appears quite often, like one person who drowned, he appeared dripping wet to his mother. So there's some part of the physical situation which can extend into the experience. And then he came into the light as he was walking towards her. So in other words, he was becoming transcendent, and he said to his mum, don't worry, I'm okay, so please don't worry about me. And then he disappeared. And that's the sort of quality of those experiences. And the mother, who was in Australia, the son drowned in England, immediately on waking, finally rang up England to find, in fact, that he was in a boat accident at this time. Now, so distance is no difficulty, and situation is no difficulty, because we got a very nice one from a submariner who was under the water when his grandmother died, and she found him there and went
so she could see him there.
I don't know, but he said
somehow,
she could.
Yes.
And he got a message from her that in fact she died and she was okay, and he should wanted to come and say goodbye, because they were very close emotionally. So that's the bond which drives that. And then there are all the phenomena which occur. Light in the room, transcendent lights in the room of the dying. the impression of things leaving, very much like the Tibetan Book of the Dead. You get people who describe mirages or altering consciousness over the, or altering, or an altered view of the person, or they say that it's fragile, it's like smoke coming from the body, but it's not smoke, they all say that. Now the interesting thing is that if you have brothers and sisters there, some Sims will see it and some won't. So this tells me that if I take a camera there, I'm not going to see anything. Because it's not an experience at that level, it's obviously a relationship between the consciousness of the two individuals. Birds are very common. They sit on the windowsills of the hospices. Nice story from Deerfield, very precise man, always very neat and tidy. When he died, a big white snowy owl came and sat in a tree, and everybody looked at the snowy owl, because you don't get snowy owls there. Said, we know who that is. And then when his funeral came, the snowy owl disappeared. So there's a linkage with birds. Cats and dogs. Cats know when their owners die, and dogs know when their owners die. So the whole set of phenomena around that, which are very poorly studied at the moment, which will help us. But there is an amazing woman in Switzerland. Her name is Monica Renz. And I'd recommend anybody who views this to look up Monica Renz's work, because it is outstanding and it takes on from where we left off. We left off with the fact that about 30% of carers recognized that the people they were caring for had become transcendent. They would go in and out of another world like this in the process of dying. Now, what Monica Renz has done, she has done the study which we wanted to do, because she is in fact in hospices, and she's also a theologian, so she's got an interest in training in asking people about transcendence, and it turns out that about 80 to 90% of people go into this transcendent realm before they die. And it's as if they are getting 80 to 90% of those people are conscious. It's not trivial. Okay, how many people has she done it on? Well, one study was on 250 people dying of cancer, and another study on over 400. So it's a good database there. So the chances are it'll probably happen to us as we die. So we all ought to know this. So you're going to this transcendent level and come back again. And get guidance on what the dying process is, she says. Now, or the dying say. The other interesting thing about this is that she's looked at the quality of death that people have, and she's, in one of her papers, she's got a nice list of all those people who have easy deaths. Now, what she has noticed is that... Easy mean painless? Keep pain on a different level, because I'm talking about spiritual pain.
The way they are inside themselves. How
inside.
they feel about it.
Spiritual pain, physical pain is looked after by the doctors, that's their field. But easy and difficult deaths, which is essentially spiritual pain, is something different. Those who have near-death experiences have easy transitions. Those who meditate have easier transitions. Those who do yoga have easier transitions. So what this is saying is that an awakening of your own more subtle nature will lead to an easier death. So it's very important. But she also says, and I'm sure that this is correct too, is that it's your ability to give up that will lead to you having a reasonable death. And when she says give up, she means give up. So you have to give everything up.
Let go.
Let go of everything. And remember, shrouds have no pockets. So you can't put something in that you're going to keep.
Yes.
So you have to let go of absolutely everything. And then the transition is much cleaner. And if you remember the fact that you're going to get some guidance, A, from the dead relatives that come, and B, from going in transcendence, there's nothing to be frightened of.
Yes.
And so I think the message from all the work which we've done is no, you don't have to be frightened, but you do have to know how to die properly. So you asked me one thing which I'd like to see happen, and that is proper teaching about what death actually is. And so we come to understand the process better.
And I think if we ever can get to that point of people really considering this something, let me study how death is, I think that would change people's life.
Oh yes, and the Dalai Lama is very clear on this. He says that those people who don't understand that death is part of life and reject death, they have different characteristics. They're very greedy because you can accumulate and accumulate and accumulate.
And maybe they fight against things inside of themselves that they should better accept, transform, and try to make the world something that the world really appears not to be.
Yes.
That's quite interesting. What you said just made me think that we open a completely new or an interesting parallel area of research that would be, are people that, or those that are interested in meditation, is it that them doing meditation that causes them to have an easier death? Or was there another factor that was there before that was causal to make them interested in meditation?
You've got a nice PhD project there.
Yes, because we can see interesting points there.
But it's really interesting.
Yeah.
So is it meditation just a manifestation of a greater awareness of some sort, or is it the actual process of meditation? It's going to be both, actually, isn't it?
Probably, I think, it comes together. More a relation than a cause.
Yeah.
But that is very interesting. It would be interesting to go into that. Thank you so much. Hope you are happy with everything. Anything else you would like to add, Dr. Fenwick?
If I was non-dual, I'd be deeply happy with everything and satisfied, because that is the moment.
Perfect.
Thank you very much.
I'm so happy you could talk, and I found this enlightening, pleasant, and I'd love to meet you personally and have more time. Thank you for all of those that have been with us for all of this time. Thank you. See you next interview.